Welcome to episode 195 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. Each week we walk you through the Epicurean texts and we discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at epicureanfriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. This week, we're continuing our discussion of books 1 and 2 of Cicero's On Ends, which are largely devoted to Epicurean philosophy. On Ends contains important criticisms of Epicurus that have set the tone for analysis of his philosophy for the last 2,000 years. And going through this book gives us an opportunity to review those attacks and take them apart and respond to them as we think an ancient Epicurean might have done, which would be much more fully than Cicero allowed Torquatus, his Epicurean spokesman, to do. Last week, we opened a brief discussion of Book 2, but this week we're going to get into it in detail. We're using the Reed edition as we've discussed before, and we're going to start on page 32 of the Reed edition, which is very close to the end of Roman numeral 2, where Cicero is stating his complaint about Epicurus's alleged lack of clarity in defining what he's talking about when he talks about pleasure. And so Cicero says this: "Now I should like you to define what pleasure is, for our whole inquiry deals with that." And then Torquatus responds, "Pray, who is there that does not know what pleasure is, or requires some definition to make it plainer?" Cicero says, "I should proclaim myself to be such a person, but that I believe myself to have a thorough notion of pleasure and a quite stable idea and conception of it in my mind. As it is, however, I allege that Epicurus himself is in the dark about pleasure and uncertain in his idea of it, and that the very man who often asserts that the meaning which our terms denote ought to be accurately represented sometimes does not see what this term pleasure indicates. I mean, what the thing is which is denoted by the term." Now, Torquatus is going to respond to that, but in stating this introduction, I think this really hammers home the point that Cicero believes Epicurus's discussion of pleasure is not clear. And he's going to go into detail about why he thinks it's not clear in just a moment. But that's the first touchstone of this discussion. At least for the moment, Cicero is willing to put aside some of his criticisms of where pleasure stands in the ethical chain. But he's saying that Epicurus doesn't make clear what pleasure is, and he doesn't understand it. And of course, Cicero is not going to accept that he doesn't understand something, because he's Cicero and he understands everything about Greek and Latin, as he's going to explain also. But what do we think about where Cicero's coming from here? Is this a legitimate complaint, or is this Cicero being a lawyer and setting up a straw man, so to speak?
It's pretty clear that what he's trying to do is sort of draw a wedge between Epicurus and the other philosophers of the question, I think. We're going to read about Hieronymus of Rhodes and what he had to think about this, but he's trying to, like I said, drive a wedge here, and he wants Epicurus to fall on one side or the other. But Torquatus isn't really going to let him do that, because pleasure is not exclusively mental any more than it is exclusively physical. Pleasure occupies all of these domains. But Cicero is not willing to allow a definition that is that broad, which is a problem for Cicero, but not really for us, I don't think.
Joshua, I do see, at least when I think back over the number of years that I've been studying Epicurus, I have to admit that there is some initial attractiveness in Cicero's argument that Epicurus is not entirely clear. I know I've wrestled myself for many years with the letter to Menorchius as, when we mean pleasure, we mean the absence of pain. Some people seem to think that that is absolutely clear and that you don't need to know anything more than to simply hear those words stated over and over and over again. Pleasure is the absence of pain, and you're going to understand what that means. I personally have not been one of those people who have found those few words to be clear and complete enough to satisfy me that I was understanding what was going through Epicurus's mind. And I'm thinking to myself as we go through this, one of the reasons it's so valuable is I don't think I'm alone in questioning, well, what exactly does Epicurus mean when he says pleasure is the absence of pain? I know what pleasure means when I'm eating ice cream or cake or candy or riding a roller coaster or looking at some painting that I like or listening to some music I like. I know what that means, but I don't generally call that the absence of pain. So something must be going on beyond my normal understanding of the word. And again, I don't think I'm alone in questioning what really is happening here. And so I don't know if anybody has any comment on how much of an issue this is. Again, maybe it's just limited to me personally as finding it difficult to understand. But Cicero, being a lawyer that he is, probably perceives that there is in this formula, pleasure is the absence of pain, an ambiguity that requires some kind of additional explanation. What do you think about that?
Right. And bear in mind that Cicero is part of a tradition in a famous story that tried to define human beings as featherless bipeds, right? So there's an element of absurdity in their project. We can certainly clarify what Epicurus has to say about pleasure and absence of pain because he's very, very technical on that point. He says that the limit of the quantity of pleasure is the removal of all that is painful. It's not a one-to-one correspondence between absence of pain, therefore pleasure, right? That everything that is absence of pain is pleasure. That's the limit of the quantity of pleasure, that when you take away every possible painful experience in that moment, all of the mental anguish and anxiety, your depression, your worry, your fear, when all of that's gone, you have reached a state of maximal pleasure. But it's not the only kind of pleasure. Even though you've reached the limit of the quantity of pleasure, you still have a nearly infinite variety of pleasurable experiences that you can pursue. And I don't know if that helps to clear it up, but that the quantity of pleasure is you reach a point in your life where you are experiencing what sometimes they call the fullness of pleasure. But that doesn't mean that that's a definition of pleasure, right? That's sort of describing pleasure, but it's not really defining it. I'm not sure Epicurus is going to give us a definition. Cassius, you are anxious to jump in.
I am anxious to say something, Joshua, because yes, I agree with most of what you've said, and I could explain and find a way to agree with everything that you said. The most important thing that I agree with is when you said principle doctrine number 3, Epicurus is talking about the limit of quantity of pleasure is the absence of pain. I think that he is stating, as you're saying, about the fullness of pleasure, that full, it's a word that means it's complete. And if it's less than complete, if it's less than full, then it's not full. And it doesn't matter whether you've drained it almost to the bottom or whether you've just got 1% missing. If you've got something missing from full, it's not full. It's not complete. And the limit of pleasure is when all of your experience, every bit of it, without exception and without reduction, is full of pleasure. You can't go higher than being full. You can't go higher than 100%. It would not make sense to say that you're looking for 200% pleasure in your life. You want full and complete pleasure as 100%, but that's the logical maximum is 100% is full. So I think what you've said there, I think is exactly right. Now, you've raised something that I don't know that we've discussed, but you said it slightly differently too, when you said that the quantity of pleasure is not the same as the quantity of absence of pain. I'm not so sure about that. Let's go back over that for just a minute, because if you're looking at a particular experience in your life and you say that that experience has no pain, I'm thinking that that does mean that that experience is pleasure. Is that the way you're saying it, or did I mishear what you said?
I don't remember saying what you thought I said, but it's possible that I did, so don't rule it out. No, I think that you have this sort of bandwidth of sort of feeling experience, right? That bandwidth has a limit, and that when the pain is all gone, all kinds of pain that you can experience are gone. The only thing left in that bandwidth is pleasure. And then it's just a question of what kind of pleasures are occupying different percentages of the bandwidth at that given moment. But when the pain's gone, it's all pleasure.
Okay. Now, and probably I've misheard what you said first time, because I'm sure that any ambiguity in what you said is probably on me as opposed to on you. But again, based on what you just said, I would ask the question, let's put aside for a moment the limit of pleasure issue and the fullness of pleasure issue. And let's just talk about any individual pleasure or any individual experience, not the fullness of experience, not 100% experience, but just a experience. Dare I say, let's talk about Chrysippus's hand. Let's talk about your hand at this moment. I presume your hand at this moment is neither being massaged by a specialist or dipping in ivory liquid to make it soft. Your hand is probably just doing exactly what your hand is normally doing. I interpret the example that Torquatus gives about Chrysippus as saying that that hand in its normal condition, and I would use that as just an example of an experience, that particular experience at that moment of your hand, if it is not pain, it is pleasure. Do you agree with that?
See, here's the issue. The hand is not really an instrument for feeling pleasure. The hand is an instrument for moving things around in the world, moving the body around in the world, and receiving signals that then get sent to the brain. And the brain, to me, is really where pleasure and pain happen.
I think that's one of the things that makes the hand example so difficult is you're right. The hand is not normally thinking about anything or really registering a feeling necessarily on its own. It's a part of your body. So let's take an example of Joshua. We're recording this right now at 10:05 a.m. on October the 8th. And let's talk about the next minute of Joshua's experience from 10:05 to 10:06, this slice of experience. And let's presume that you are neither thrilled with happiness upon listening to my explanation or my voice, nor are you bored to tears, as you probably should be. You're just simply receiving the sound waves and not even having a reaction to them at that moment, just simply listening. You're simply listening. Can we say during that period of time when you're simply listening and you're neither filled with joy nor with sorrow that you are in pleasure? Because I'm thinking Torquatus is saying, if you're not in pain, you are in pleasure.
Yeah, but the reality is I'm probably experiencing both pleasure and pain.
You're segmenting it in different ways.
Yeah, in different areas. I probably have like a slight, my back is a little bit sore because I woke up half an hour ago and I maybe didn't sleep right. There are issues that happen all over your body or your mind that cause issues. That's why you're right. It can be confusing the way that the Epicureans speak about this, because it's a question as to whether it's like, is it all pain? And then when that's gone, it's all pleasure? Or is it the case that it's possible to experience more pleasure than pain or more pain than pleasure in any given moment? And I think that's the way we should be looking at it, is that in any given moment in your life, some areas of your life are giving you pleasure, some areas of your life are giving you pain. And the job of philosophy is to try to minimize the areas of your life that are giving you pain.
And so you've mentioned several areas of your life, Joshua, as you were going through that explanation. Let's pick one. Pick one experience. Pick one example.
Okay. It's Sunday and I know I have to go to work tomorrow.
Okay. Knowing you have to go to work tomorrow is by definition in the Epicurean viewpoint either a pleasure or a pain, right?
Right. But in reality, what I'm probably doing is the experience of me anticipating going to work tomorrow could be pleasurable or painful. But what I'm anticipating is pleasure and pain.
I have a question, because I find this fascinating, okay, because we're really getting into practical issues here. So when you think about tomorrow, is it going to be bodily pain or mental pain that could occur?
Oh, it'll be mental pain. Yeah. I don't like work in general, so it'll definitely be mental pain. But there will be pleasures associated with it. The reason I work is because I have to work. I need money in order to live. If I was independently wealthy, I would stop working. And I would organize my life in such a way that I was having more pleasure every day and in the long run. So there's sort of that like, ho-hum, work again, I don't want to do this, but I do it because I have to. But that doesn't mean I'm consigning myself to 8 hours of pure human misery just because I don't want to be there necessarily, and I'd rather be somewhere else. I'm still capable of finding pleasure while doing it. And that's more or less always been the case.
Joshua, when you read Principal Doctrine 3 just a few moments ago, you started with the first sentence of Principal Doctrine 3 about the limit of pleasure, but I'm not sure you read the second sentence. And that second sentence is, quote, wherever pleasure is present, as long as it is there, there is neither pain of body, nor of mind, nor of both at once. Now, I would read that as a statement that wherever pleasure is present, there is no pain. And I would read it as saying that where there is pain, there is no pleasure. But there's a word there called wherever that I think is important. We've been talking with Godfrey about pleasures in terms of duration, intensity, and location. So especially if we're thinking wherever means location, if you locate in your experience one segment of experience and you drill down to that moment of experience, then it seems to me Epicurus is saying that you're either going to find that experience to be pleasurable or you're going to find that experience to be painful. And obviously, we all live on a continuous timeline over time. We're experiencing different things in different parts of our bodies at the same time, just like Epicurus had a kidney problem when he was about to die, while at the same time, his mind was enjoying pleasure. So we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can do more than one thing at once. But when you drill down and isolate a specific, discrete experience, it seems to me that that specific, discrete experience in Epicurean philosophy is going to be labelable as either pleasure or pain and not a mixture of the two. Do you agree with that?
Well, tell me, what level of experience are we talking about? Are we talking about the level of a neuron, the level of a second?
Well, since Epicurus says in Principal Doctrine 2 that something that is without sensation is nothing to us, we're basically, I think, talking about a sensation that you are aware of. You certainly have to be aware of it to be something that we should even be discussing. But a particular sensation is it not either pleasure or pain?
I find this almost impossible to answer, but, imagine if you've raised a child for 18 years and now your child is going off to college. And in the moment when they pull out of the driveway and head off down the road, that's a single experience. But are you only experiencing pleasure or pain in that moment?
You certainly break it down into different aspects of it, to which you have different reactions according to the aspect.
Right. Now, my full answer depends on the ability to find a quote, but I don't remember where it comes from. I actually think it comes from what we're reading. Do you remember this, Cassius? He says something along the lines of, there will never be a time when you do not experience more pleasure than pain. I distinctly remember the more pleasure than pain.
Yes, it's in the same section by Torquatus, Onion's Book 1, Section 62. He's talking about the wise man who has correct views of the gods and death and so forth. He says, furnished with these advantages, he is continually in a state of pleasure, and there is in truth no moment at which he does not experience more pleasures than pains. And he continues on the same point. He says he remembers the past with thankfulness and the present as his own and so forth. And then he says, and pains, if any befall him, have never power enough to prevent the wise man from finding more reasons for joy than for vexation. And I think you're right to bring that up, because it seems to me he's examining these issues discreetly, these experiences discreetly. There's discrete experiences of pain, there's discrete experiences of pleasure, and the wise man will offset them against each other in order to conclude that his life has more reason for joy than for vexation.
Yeah, you express that very well. And that's kind of the level on which I would prefer to think about this stuff. It is possible, as you were asking me a moment ago, I'm sure it's possible to drill down to a level of experience where you can find, like, okay, this sensation is entirely and discreetly pleasurable, and this other sensation is entirely and discreetly painful. And to a degree, that's what that quote even mentions, right? That you're experiencing pleasure and pain, and that there are discrete experiences of pleasure and there are discrete experiences of pain. But at a higher level, you're experiencing both. And that's really the life that most of us are going to live, I'm sitting in this chair, as you asked me earlier in this episode, and you said, are you experiencing pleasure or pain right now? I'm experiencing both. That's kind of my answer to the question.
Okay. Well, we'll go ahead and move on into section 3, but I would not expect us to really have a absolutely clear and complete consensus at this point, because I think this is the issue that Cicero is driving home, that there are ambiguities about how Epicurus is dealing with this that have to be resolved. And I'm interpreting what you're saying, Joshua, is you're very reluctant to separate them out and view them discretely because you see them as a sum. And so therefore you just think it's natural to view them that way, and it's really kind of even unnatural to separate them out and try to treat pleasures and pains like you're talking about individual atoms or something. But let's go forward, because I think we're going to learn a lot about this as we go forward, as Cicero goes into his questioning further. Because then at that point, Torquatus says with a smile, "This is truly an excellent thought, that he who declares pleasure to be supreme among objects of desire and the final and ultimate good knows nothing of the essence and attributes of the thing itself." And Cicero replies, "Nay, either Epicurus is ignorant, or else all human beings who are to be found anywhere are ignorant what pleasure is." Now, Cicero has Torquatus say, "How so?" as if Torquatus doesn't understand what Cicero is saying.
Stun me with your brilliance.
Yes, yes.
Stun me with your brilliance, Cicero.
And Cicero replies, "Because all pronounce that thing to be pleasure, by the reception of which sense is excited and is pervaded by a certain agreeable feeling." Okay, let's stop at that point for just a moment. How do you guys interpret that? Because it seems to me Cicero is trying to define pleasure as what he calls something which excites the senses with an agreeable feeling. Excitement is maybe the key word there. Agreeable feeling, I doubt anybody has any problem with, but he's saying that the senses are excited, and that's the definition of pleasure. Anybody have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think even now we have that same understanding of the word pleasure, that it is excitement of the senses.
This would be a point in time where it would probably be excellent to consult other translations, because I'd be curious to see how they put that word, excited. But nevertheless, what Cicero appears to be getting across here is there has to be some stimulus, some positive stimulus, right? Not just the negative stimulus of the removal of pain. That's not really sufficient. There has to be something poking your senses in a way that feels good for him to say, this experience is pleasure.
Right. I think I've seen the word tickling used there, something like that. It's got to be something, and I want to say something from the outside, but I'm not sure that that's a requirement. It's got to be something that whatever it is that is really stimulating your senses, or even your mind. It's got to be stimulative or exciting or tickling. We probably find some other words, but they're all going to have some active component to them that would unite them as saying that all pronounce that thing to be pleasure, which is an excitement of the senses with an agreeable feeling. Okay, so there we go. Cicero has said this is what everybody says about the nature of pleasure. And then Torquatus responds, well then, is Epicurus unfamiliar with that kind of pleasure? And here Cicero gets some of his ad hominem attacks in, because Cicero says, not always, I replied, for Epicurus is now and then too familiar with it, since he avers that he cannot even understand where any good exists, or what is its nature, unless such good as is experienced from food and drink and the gratification of the ears and from impure pleasures. He probably means sex there. Is this not, in fact, what he says? Again, it's this argument through intimidation that Cicero seems to be using to say that these pleasures that he's talking about can't possibly be the nature of life. Cicero says, is this not, in fact, what he says?
Yeah, Cicero clearly wants to restrict all nuance and meaning and definition in the word pleasure to just this, something striking the bodily senses in such a way that it causes an agreeable feeling. That's his definition of pleasure. And he's saying to Torquatus, why does Epicurus not understand this? But it's possible, as we're going to find out, that Epicurus has reached a different definition to the word pleasure.
Or
a wider, that's exactly the right word, a wider definition of pleasure that's going to include not just stimuli exciting the neurons at the end of your fingertips or elsewhere in your body, but pleasures that happen because of other reasons, like pain receding away, like a bare escape from death, or like just normal mental pleasures like flow and the happiness from having created something. There's all different kinds, functionally an infinite variety of pleasures. But Cicero is like, no. This is my world. Pleasure means just this one thing. And if Epicurus doesn't understand that, then he is the fool.
Somebody who was a good dramatist could get some emotion going in some of this dialogue, because I think this next sentence could be read a variety of different ways. But once Cicero states that Epicurus is too familiar with pleasure because he's into the gratification of the senses and so forth, what does Torquatus say in response? And I'll try to put some emotion into this, because Torquatus appears to say, as if I were ashamed of the words you quote, or unable to explain in what sense they are used, with an exclamation point, according to Reed here. But Torquatus is saying, I'm not going to back away from the pleasures of food and drink and the gratification of the ears and the senses. I'm not going to back away from that at all. But I have an explanation of the sense in which he's using the word pleasure that is wider than that. So then Cicero says, I assure you that I do not question your ability to explain that easily, nor have you any cause to be ashamed of repeating things said by a wise man, who is the only one, so far as I know, that has ever ventured to announce himself as a wise man. So here he comes up with another. Epicurus is such a jerk that he considers himself to be a wise man, when Socrates, the paragon of virtue as a philosopher, was the first to admit that he didn't know anything. I don't suppose that Metrodorus announced himself as a wise man, but rather that when Epicurus gave him the title, he did not like to thrust from him so great a favor. He says something about the well-known seven, again, obtained the title not by their own vote, but by that of all nations. Joshua, you got something to say about who the seven are?
Yeah, well, the problem is we don't know who the seven are, because it's a constantly changing number. It's kind of like the seven wonders of the world. Those are always changing as well. So he's referring here to these sort of semi-mythical seven sages of Greece. I can give you an example of one list of the seven sages of Greece. Despite fluctuations, 4 of the 7 sages of Greece persist in almost every version. So Thales of Miletus, this is the father, really, of natural philosophy. Cicero gives the title of father of philosophy to Socrates, but Thales was doing it 200 years or more before Socrates was born. So Thales of Miletus, Solon of Athens, who is, I think, a kind of a lawgiver, and then names I've never even heard of, like Pittacus of Mytilene, Bias or Bias of Priene. And then the remaining 3 are typically Chelon of Sparta, Cleobulus of Lindos, and Periander of Corinth. And they're just traditional figures, like I said, semi-mythological figures almost, that are known for having made strides toward different intellectual pursuits while they were alive. Legendary lawgivers or great philosophers, great astronomers. So that's the list. And as Cicero is saying here, they didn't call themselves wise. They didn't call themselves the 7 sages of Greece. So why is Epicurus calling himself a wise man?
Yes, Cicero is saying basically that Epicurus is not modest and humble like he should be. And this gives me an opportunity. I don't get a chance often to mention our friend Ellie from Greece. But we've had a discussion briefly about modesty, and Ellie has pointed out that that's not necessarily an Epicurean virtue. To be falsely humble, falsely modest would not be consistent with Epicurus's views. You want to be honest about whether you are right or wrong on something. And Epicurus has taken the position that his philosophy is correct. So he's taken the position that he is a wise man from that point of view. He's taking the position that he is correct about these important issues, and so therefore he's considering people who have that position to be wise people. Let's go on. And then Cicero continues. He says, however, I take it for granted at this point that when Epicurus holds such language, he certainly understands the word pleasure to bear the same sense that the rest of the world gives it. All men, in fact, described by the term hedone in Greek and the term voluptas in Latin, an agreeable excitement by which the sense is cheered. Torquatus then says in response, then what else do you want, Cicero? What else do you want? Cicero says, I'll tell you because I wish to be instructed. I don't want to find fault with you or Epicurus. Torquatus says, I too would be better pleased to learn anything that you have to bring forward than to find fault with you. Now, that little interlude does nothing to advance the storyline here. But at any rate.
This is a mutual congratulations society.
Yes. A typical politician kind of thing. My gentleman from the state of Illinois and I have such a great relationship. It's very infuriating. But anyway, here's the key and where we're going to introduce this very important topic of Hieronymus of Rhodes. Cicero says, "Do you understand then what Hieronymus of Rhodes declares to be the supreme good, the standard of which he thinks all things should be judged?" And Torquatus says, "I understand that he, Hieronymus of Rhodes, holds freedom from pain to be the final good." And let's go ahead and let me lay it all out before we start talking about it. "Well," Cicero said, "what view does this same philosopher Hieronymus of Rhodes hold of pleasure?" Torquatus answers, "He asserts that it is not essentially an object of desire." And Cicero says, "So Hieronymus of Rhodes is of the opinion that joy is one thing, absence of pain another." And Torquatus says, "Yes, and he is grossly mistaken. For as I have proved a little while ago, the limit to the increase of pleasure consists in the removal of all pain." Now, let's stop there and go through what we've just discussed. There's a lot packed into this issue of Hieronymus of Rhodes. There appears to be very little known about Hieronymus of Rhodes. Joshua, did you pick up anything about him? He's thought to be a peripatetic, a follower of Aristotle, but apparently that's not even clear.
So what Wikipedia has to say on this is that Hieronymus of Rhodes was a peripatetic philosopher, but that his works only survive in fragmentary form. And interestingly enough, that it's Cicero himself who questions his right to the title of peripatetic. Here's the problem. Cicero is almost the only source that we have on this. I guess Diogenes Laertius mentions two of his works, and that he may have done some work on poetry. But that's basically it. So our main source for this, apart from Diogenes Laertius and Rufinus, is Cicero.
So we don't have any way of knowing the truth of whether Hieronymus of Rhodes really held the beliefs that Cicero is alleging that he held or not. But to some extent, I would say that that's not entirely a defect, but for purposes of our analysis might actually be a feature, in the sense that we can understand from what Cicero was saying that this point that Cicero is bringing out is the key issue that needs to be considered. Because we could go off on a long history of the details of Hieronymus of Rhodes if the information were available to us. But for purposes of our understanding this back and forth, the key issue and the only issue that Cicero is explaining here is that Hieronymus of Rhodes held that the supreme good is the absence of pain. And that in doing so, Hieronymus, in Cicero's view, was more consistent than Epicurus, because Hieronymus of Rhodes held that if the supreme good is the absence of pain, you have no need of pleasure. And I don't know if I've read that 10 times or 100 times or 1,000 times in commentators on Epicurus. But that seems to me to be a huge, huge problem in a lot of the analysis that people will read on the internet about Epicurus. It's almost as if they are alleging that you don't have any pleasure at all until you have banished all pain from your existence. They're saying that the real and truly only pleasure in life, the real goal of life, is absence of pain, without any further explanation of what that means. And I've gone on ad nauseum about that in the past. But this is where Torquatus then says that Hieronymus of Rhodes was, quote, grossly mistaken. So here we're coming to terms with Torquatus, the spokesman of Epicurus, who's presumably one of the most educated people in Epicurean philosophy in 50 BC. Torquatus is saying that absence of pain is not the supreme good. Let me say that again. Torquatus says that I understand that Hieronymus holds freedom from pain to be the final good. But Cicero thinks he's backing Torquatus into a corner by saying that if the absence of pain is the final good, then you have no need of pleasure, because Hieronymus says you have no need of pleasure. But Torquatus says that that view of Hieronymus of Rhodes is grossly mistaken. So, Joshua, now it's time to explain how is the view that the absence of pain is the supreme good grossly mistaken?
This is challenging stuff here, Cassius. So I almost can't even get my head around this problem, because if it's true that the limit of the quantity of pleasure or whatever is the absence or the removal of all that is painful, and pleasure is the supreme good, then isn't it correct to say that the absence of pain is the highest good? It's just not a full definition of what is the highest good.
Your last phrase there is the key part. Let me channel some more Cicero here, because Cicero says, I'll examine afterwards, Torquatus, what is the sense of your expression, absence of pain. But that pleasure means one thing and absence of pain another, you must grant me, unless you are very obstinate. And what does Torquatus say in response to that? Oh, but you will find me obstinate in this matter, for no doctrine can be more truly stated. So he is saying that pleasure and absence of pain are the same thing, and he's not going to back off on that statement. But at the same time, he's saying that Hieronymus of Rhodes was wrong in considering the absence of pain to be the supreme good. How do you make sense of that? And I think there's a way to do it, but we ought to just revel in the ambiguity and the complexity of this for a few minutes, because I do think this is so critical to Epicurean philosophy. If you can't come to terms with Cicero's argument against this, you're not going to be as confident in Epicurus's conclusions as you otherwise might be. In fact, you'll think that Cicero is right and Epicurus is wrong, and let's go read some Plato.
Yeah, I'm still having trouble with this. It seems that Hieronymus of Rhodes is considering absence of pain to be like a pure, unadulterated state, not subject to the description of pleasure, but just its own state, right? Aponia is the word for it. And that state is the highest good, the final and best good. And that once you've reached that state, you've reached a point in your life where you have no need of the grosser sensory pleasures to enhance it, because it can't be enhanced. It's already the best thing there is. That's his position. But Torquatus is saying that it's true that the absence of pain is the highest good. And it's true that almost that there is this state of once the pain is all gone, that's the best life you can have. That's the highest amount of pleasure that it's possible to have. So is it the only difference, Cassius, to say that between these two philosophers, one of them says that state is good enough and you don't need physical pleasures to go along with it, and one of them says, yeah, I'll take the physical pleasures too. It's only going to get better and more varied and more interesting from there?
Well, I would answer that by saying that, yes, that is sort of a description of their difference. But I would agree with Torquatus that Hieronymus of Rhodes is engaged in the grossest of errors, because there is no reason whatsoever to limit yourself to something that you're calling absence of pain without describing it. And Joshua, as I'm listening to your description of the problem here, you are continuing to repeat it exactly as Torquatus is saying it here in terms of talking about the extreme point. Torquatus is continuing to repeat that this extreme point is easy to identify, that total absence of pain is the highest pleasure. That is one observation, but it seems to me, the point we were discussing earlier, that absence of pain is pleasure, and that you don't obsess over the limit. You identify that at any moment in your life, in any discrete experience you want to interpret, that experience is to be deemed pleasure, and is pleasure unless it is specifically painful. And so when Hieronymus of Rhodes wants to limit the supreme good to absence of pain, but he wants to throw pleasure out, when he wants to throw the stimulations out, he's totally ignoring the truth that Epicurus seems to be describing, that when you're not in pain, you're in pleasure. And you could probably say that 5,000 different ways. At the top of the forum right now, the phrase that we discussed last week in Latin was quod dolore caret id in voluptate est, which comes from section 11 of book 1. People translate it different ways. That which is free from pain is in a state of pleasure. Anything which is cut off from the state of pain is in the state of pleasure. To be without pain is to be in a state of pleasure. Whatever is free from pain is in pleasure. I think that you can't interpret these as meaning that you have to be totally free from pain before you're experiencing any pleasure at all. Rather,
certainly not. No, that can't be the case.
That can't be the case.
If that were the case, then any experience of pleasure would make you an Epicurean god, right? That's their whole shtick, is that they experience this fullness of pleasure without any admixture of pain. And so if you were, anytime you say, oh no, I feel good, then, oh wow, you really are rivaling Zeus for happiness. I think that the typical human experience, I would almost go so far as to say that the lot that is given to us is that we experience pleasure and pain. and that the goal then is to experience far more pleasure than pain. I have a feeling now, Cassius, that I've taken one step too far in your view.
I think this is the issue, and I don't know whether Cicero has set this up in his presentation here to take advantage of it, but I do think that there are two issues involved here. The fullest experience of pleasure is to be completely without pain, but in any discrete experience of life, it's either pleasure or pain, and they coexist. They don't mix, seems to be the word, because you always only have pleasure or pain, and you don't have a third type of experience called pain pleasure or something that we could get some Germans to help us combine some words and come up with a totally new word. But you don't have a third type of experience. It's only pleasure or it's pain, but it's not both. It's not neither. It's one of the two. And when you see that whatever your experience is that's not painful is pleasurable, then I think you see a much different perspective that, as Torquatus is insisting, you include the pleasures of wine, women, song, sex, drugs, rock and roll, so long as they don't bring so much pain that they offset the pleasure that they bring. It's not the activity in itself that is a problem, because many activities can be painful or pleasurable in different circumstances. But what you're doing is you do have your eye on the goal of 100% pleasure, of absolute painlessness, if you can eliminate every pain from your life. That's where we had a thread this past week about what's the difference between 100% pleasure and 99% pleasure. 100% pleasure is pretty clearly the absence of pain, 0% pain. But does that mean that if you're at 99% pleasure and you've got 1% pain in your life, that you're somehow totally divorced from pleasure, that you've somehow failed to meet the summit experience? Well, it would mean that if you remove the final 1%, you'd have some kind of a big bang, transcendent experience of something totally new that's not pleasure at all. I don't think that is a rational reading. What they're saying here is what you would have at 100% pleasure is pure pleasure. But what you also have at 99% pleasure is pretty darn close to pure pleasure, and not something that's different in kind, 100% not being different in kind than 99%, just different in degree. And in fact, if we go a little bit further here, we can hear Torquatus talking about degree, because Torquatus says, as we've just discussed, you will find me obstinate in this matter, for no doctrine can be more truly stated that pleasure is the absence of pain. And then Cicero is just aghast. The same pleasure that he feels when the thirst has been quenched, Torquatus says, no, a pleasure different in kind. For the quenching of the thirst brings a steady pleasure, whereas the pleasure which accompanies the process of quenching itself consists in agitation. Cicero says, why do you describe those two different things by the same name? And the answer Torquatus gives is, don't you recall what I said a little while before, that once all pain has been removed, pleasure admits of varieties, but not of increase. And Cicero says, I do remember, but though your statement is in good Latin, it's far from clear. And then he goes off into a discussion of what the word variety means in Latin. But let's stop for a second on that point. The quenching of thirst brings with it a steady pleasure, in the sense that you're no longer thirsty, and you can go for significant periods of time, once you've drunk all you need, not being thirsty anymore. And he's distinguishing that from the pleasure which accompanies the process of drinking, of quenching the thirst, which Torquatus says consists in agitation. But while Cicero screams, you're talking about two different things, you're calling both of them pleasure, that's exactly what Torquatus is doing. He's considering both of those things to be pleasure. The normal existence of life when you're not thirsty is a pleasure, while also drinking something to get rid of your thirst is also a pleasure. They are both pleasures.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of how we can put this. So it seems to me that Cicero is looking at defining pleasure by the external stimulus that prompts it. But really, if you were going to define pleasure, you would have to define it as in what Epicurus defines it as, which is an internal feeling, the feeling of pleasure.
Agreeableness or desirableness, other words.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
But when you put the definition as an internal response rather than as an external stimulus, it becomes so clear that any number of external stimuli could trigger that same response. That's what Cicero seems to me is not understanding here.
Mhm.
And not just external stimuli, but internal promptings like thoughts and so forth.
Right. All of them fit under the same term. And you say Cicero's not understanding it, and whether he's not understanding it or whether he's just being obstinate himself in order to carry the point is a question we're not going to be able to answer. But for whatever reason, he's not accepting what Torquatus is saying, that both types of pleasure are pleasure. That's one of the lines in Diogenes Laertius, that Epicurus accepted both active and static pleasures. Let me go into this next paragraph then. So Cicero says, for variety is a Latin word and in its strict sense applied to differences of color, but metaphorically used to denote many differences. We speak of a varied poem, varied speech, varied manners, varied fortune. Pleasure, too, is usually called varied when it is derived from many unlike objects which produce pleasures that are unlike. If you intend this by the term variety, I would understand it, as indeed I do understand the word when you're not the speaker. On the other hand, Cicero says, I am far from clear what the variety is of which you speak, Torquatus, when you say that we experience the highest pleasure as often as we are without pain. When, however, we are eating things which rouse a pleasurable agitation in our senses, then the pleasures consist of agitation, which produces a variety in our pleasures. But that pleasure felt in the absence of pain is not thereby increased. And why would you call that feeling pleasure? I cannot understand.
Now I'm turning this over in my head and I'm trying to think, if we were talking instead of about pleasure, if we were talking about pain, would it be a lot easier to understand this problem? Because people do natively grasp that pain, no matter where it's felt or how it comes to us, even though you can describe it in all different terms. And when you go to the emergency room, they give you a chart and you say, 1 to 5 or whatever. That's the level of pain that I'm experiencing right now. But it's really easy to understand that stubbing your toe is painful in the same way that losing a loved one is painful. And I feel like I'm just confused as to where Cicero is going with this.
Well, this is one of my new favorite quotes of Norman DeWitt that I seem to be saying all the time, but from page 240, I think this is the issue. DeWitt says the extension of the name of pleasure to the normal state was the major innovation of the new hedonism. Now, to address what you just said, Joshua, it was in the negative form, freedom from pain of body and distress of mind, that it drew the most persistent and vigorous condemnation from adversaries. The contention was that the application of the name of pleasure to this state was unjustified on the ground that two different things were thereby being denominated by one name. Cicero made a great to-do over this argument. That's where we are right now. Cicero is making a great to-do over the argument. I'll go ahead and include DeWitt's final words on this, but it really is superficial and captious. The fact that the name of pleasure was not customarily applied to the normal or static state did not alter the fact that the name ought to be applied to it, nor that reason justified the application, nor that human beings would be the happier for so reasoning and believing. So we're in the midst of this issue that Norman DeWitt is talking about there. Cicero is saying, you're talking about two different things. You're not making any sense. I am Cicero. I understand Latin. I understand Greek. And you're full of bull because you're using words in ways that nobody can understand. And in response to that, Torquatus is insisting, I don't really care whether you understand it or not, Cicero. Absence of pain is pleasure. You have to understand how that works without becoming Hieronymus of Rhodes and ditching all of the sensual pleasures that we also embrace. So I think that's where we are in the argument. And I think this is really helpful to wrestle with these issues. Like I said earlier, it would be strange if we did find all this to be absolutely clear, because this seems to be the real crux of the attack on Epicurus, that he's using the term pleasure in ways that people normally don't use them. But when you then think about how he's using it, it makes perfect sense.
When we were first getting into book 1, at the very beginning of book 1, Torquatus and Cicero are chatting before Torquatus gets into his sort of lengthy monologue. And they're chatting about some of the things that Cicero finds disagreeable in Epicureanism. And it's stuff like Torquatus says, well, you probably just don't like him because his style is not very good. He writes in a very clear, plain style. And you, Cicero, prefer a much more elaborate style. And Cicero's like, no, no, no. I prefer that style, but I find no fault in someone who can't use it. Anyway, they go on like this, right? And Cicero's explaining the things he dislikes about Epicurus. He borrows a lot from Democritus and then denies it. He invents the doctrine of the swerve on the basis of nothing whatsoever and then can't explain it and so forth. One of the things he says in that opening bit there is that Epicurus does not make any effort at categorization. Do you remember that quote, Cassius?
Yes.
And something we kind of, I feel like, breezed past when we talked about that at the beginning. But it's clear when we get into this stuff that this is like a huge thing for Cicero. I mentioned earlier this exchange between Plato and Diogenes the Cynic, right, where Plato defines man as a featherless biped. And Diogenes the Cynic comes in carrying a plucked chicken and says, behold Plato's man. This is a major component. I really associate this with Aristotle in particular, this approach to categorize everything in nature. Is that the problem here, Cassius? Is Cicero so thirsty for delineation that everything that is even a little bit different from another thing has to fall in a different category than that other thing?
Joshua, I think that's part of the issue, but I tell you what, I don't know that I think that's the real motivation. And let me tell you what I think the real motivation is. We're going to come back next week and start again with section 4. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and let me read this part because I think this is the answer to your question. It's not so much that he's obsessed with categories like Aristotle might be, and the way that Aristotle would drone on and on and on about categories for the sake of categories. This is what motivates Cicero. In section 4, he's going to say this. Torquatus has said absence of pain is identical with pleasure and that no pleasure can be greater than the absence of pain. Cicero says this. Why then, when you've once defined your supreme good as to make it consist entirely in absence of pain, do you shrink from embracing, maintaining, and championing this exclusively? And Cicero says, I ask what need there is for you to introduce pleasure into the assembly of the virtues, like some harlot into the company of matrons. The name of pleasure is odious, disreputable, open to suspicion. So you're in the habit of telling us this very often, that we don't understand what kind of pleasure Epicurus means. Now, whenever I've been told this, and I have not been told it unfrequently, I have the habit of getting now and then a little angry, though I usually bear myself with tolerable calmness in discussion. Do I not understand what hedone means in Greek and volutas in Latin? Which, pray, of the two languages is it that I do not know? How comes it that I don't know this, even though all those who are aware of it have chosen to become Epicureans? Okay, let's stop on that point and ask for closing statements. This is really interesting material. I think a lot can be brought out of it. I'm sorry to have droned on so much today. Martin, if you're with us, closing comments today?
No comment.
Thank you, Martin. Calasini.
Yes, I am seeing that there really is a potential here for liberation. Because how much of human experience do we have some subtle kind of mental pain, but yet we're sort of trapped in it and we can't see a way out? So we have this idea, okay, there's pleasure and there's pain. If you divide everything up as either good or bad, you're locking things down in a way that is the opposite of freedom and choice. And there's something in human beings that gets trapped in a quagmire as soon as you label things as right or wrong, good or bad. For example, alcohol. Some people can drink and they can do so in a pleasurable way. Now, there are others who cannot do that. But if we see that Epicurus includes that drinking is a pleasure, it's a pleasure of the senses that is acceptable, we then open up freedom for each person to take personal responsibility for what brings pleasure and what brings pain. And you continually observe that in your own self, and you have the freedom, and that opens up so many more avenues in life for fulfillment. So we're not saying one thing's right or wrong. I don't think I'm fully explaining it, but I see this as very liberating.
Joshua?
One thing I've been focusing a lot on as we've been going through Cicero is Epicurus's will when he's describing his last day on earth, really, because I think it helps to clear up some of the confusion here as to whether pain and pleasure can coexist in the same moment. And this is what Epicurus says. He says, "On this blissful day, which is also the last of my life, I write this to you, my continual sufferings from strangury and dysentery are so great that nothing could increase them." In other words, we have reached here for Epicurus the limit of pain. The limit of the quantity of pain is the strangury and dysentery that I'm feeling right now. And then he goes on to say, "But I set above them all the gladness of mind at the memory of our past conversations." So this is kind of the eternal struggle, right, between pain, which is bad, and pleasure, which is good. And that even in your darkest moment of pain, as on Epicurus's last day on earth, if we believe what he's saying here, that he sets above all that pain and anguish the gladness of mind. There's one of those words for pleasure that Cicero is going to talk about in the next episode. The gladness of mind at the memory of our past conversations. Anyway, something to keep in mind. This is Epicurus on his deathbed, not losing sight of the main focus here, which is pleasure is going to carry him through this. The pleasure of the memory of the past experience with his friends is going to be the main thing to get him through this experience. And even though the pain of the strangury and the dysentery, kidney stones, I think is the modern sort of explanation for that, that even though this pain is so great, he can't imagine a pain greater than the pain he's experiencing right now. Even at that limit, he is able to set above that the pleasure that he is experiencing. So just as creation in the Epicurean cosmos is always one step ahead of destruction, and that's why everything doesn't just fall apart all at once. Pleasure, it seems to me, is one step ahead of pain in Epicurean ethics. And I feel like that's a good way to look at life. And this relates, Cassius, to what you were saying about, it matters how you answer the question as to whether the glass is half full or half empty, that your answer to that is indicative of your mental state and of your happiness.
Just as the phrase absence of pain can convey a bewildering sort of ambiguity, or if you define it in the terms that Torquatus and Epicurus are insisting on, you can see absence of pain as a phrase which describes the very best state of life. And it depends on the explanation and the understanding that you provide for it as to whether it makes sense and you become an Epicurean, or your eyes glaze over and say, this guy does not know what he's talking about, and you throw down the books and move on to somebody else. That's what we'll continue to discuss next week. We'll come back to this beginning of section 4. I think we've had a good discussion today. As always, I want to invite everybody to drop by the forum. We have a thread for this episode and every episode. Let us know your questions and comments. Thank you for your time today. We'll see you next week. Bye.